Hello, welcome. How's it going? Thank you for joining. I'll give some time and let me make sure it's streaming on Facebook. I have to do it manually still. So this is the backup channel for the main channel. And today I will... Okay, so now it's on live streaming on Facebook. If you join on Facebook, thank you. Welcome, welcome. So this is part 2 of the live reading. The article from the newsletter that I read yesterday. Welcome if you're joining on Facebook. All right. I remember where I left off. I was just looking at an ornament that I have of the First African Baptist Church, Cumberland Island National Seashore. I got that in 2020. So one day I'll show you. I think I've shown some of you that ornament. All right, so I'll pick up part 4. Cumberland in wartime. After 1862, Cumberland Island was largely abandoned by its residents, most of whom were Confederate sympathizers. 4 landholding households did not abandon their land. Robert Stafford remained at his home, Planter's House. Edmund Spaulding, the lighthouse keeper, and his family stayed at their farm on the island's north end. Rachel Church, a middle-aged woman, remained at Cumberland's High Point. Spaulding and Church, who were kinfolk. I just want to say this citation here, the cabin where I knew him, Nancy C. Rockefeller, to author in 1990, Nancy Carnegie Rockefeller, The Carnegies and Cumberland Island, privately printed in 1993. Lived on adjacent farms. So let me go back up. I wanted to say, okay, Spaulding and Church, who were kinfolk, lived on adjacent farms. And the Unionist Club family remained at High Point. Although most Confederate property owners departed for the mainland where they felt safer. The island was not totally deserted. From visitors carrying military passes to the occasional Union or Confederate deserter, to shipwrecked passengers and their ship's officers, to outright cattle thieves, there was no telling who would be met on the island's roads and trails. A large turpentine camp on the island was maintained by Confederate sympathizers. Island residents who remained on their property were thought to be Unionists, but few people were perfectly certain where Stafford's allegiances lay. A few Cumberland Island slaves departed their homes in 1862, possibly for their own safety. A week after the arrival of Union forces in Fernandina, many more slaves left in January 1863, immediately after the Emancipation Proclamation. By mid 1863, not only was there a shortage of hands to gather food crops, but Confederate forces more frequently gathered guerrilla style to descend upon the islanders to take what little food they had left. A wartime visitor reported one such foray to Congress. I refer to an island lying off the coast of Georgia, the greater part of which is owned by Colonel Stafford. He was born and brought up there. He is now an old gentleman, 74 or 75 years of age. About a year ago, before the war ended, I visited him on his island. He was living there all alone, attended by 2 or 3 Negro women. All the servants that were left to him on his immense plantation of 30,000 acres, of which 10,000 are under plow. When the war broke out, the Confederates ordered off both islands all the people, black and white. In some instances, they did not go, and among those who remained was Colonel Stafford. The Confederates came in boats to remove his corn and his cotton. He understood they were coming to remove his cotton, and he determined they should not have it. He first asked them to let him alone, saying he was an old man beyond the conscript age. That was on an island. That he wanted no excitement and wanted to be let alone on his own little island. They determined to remove his property and to remove him, but he declined to go alive, and they let him alone. He had, as he informed me, 600 bales of Sea Island cotton of his own raising, piled up and in his gin houses. He set his Negroes to work, piling up that cotton, and on the approach of the Confederates to carry it away, rather than they should have it, he fired it and he burned it up. He would have fired all his corn cribs, but he could not do it without burning all his buildings. Consequently, they loaded their vessels with his corn and carried it away. He had a 20,000 acre range of pasture land on which he had large droves of cattle. The Confederate forces drove off loads of his cattle for their use. The Federal gunboats came in and drove them away, and the Federals helped themselves to beef and pork and honey, and so that the old gentleman was awfully stripped by both armies, while he never gave anything to either. Among other things, as he told me, 300 of his able-bodied Negro men went either into the United States Army or the United States Navy. And now, the old gentleman says, standing on his porch with tears flowing down his face and with his long gray locks floating in the wind, Here I am with nothing but the land, and the order of General Sherman takes me off the island. Let's see. Hello, welcome, welcome. If you're joining on Facebook, welcome. Hey there, Sean, Mish. Hey there. Thanks for joining. I'm picking back up the reading of the article. Okay. Although Mitchell's family fled to Fernandina, Primus himself remained on Cumberland Island, not anxious to join the crowds of displaced slaves seeking refuge in Fernandina. Mitchell's family went to a Union garrison town for their personal safety, thereby introducing Primus to missionary Ansel E. Kine, 1820 to 1890. Primus would have identified himself as a gardener for Mr. Stafford, and perhaps at Kine's instigation, may have promised to find additional field hands to settle there with him. It would be a natural development if he had done so. The army was unable to feed all the hungry refugees. Now, let me ask you, is the sound quality good? I should ask. I just started reading. Can someone give me an indication if everything sounds good before I go on? It should be good. I'm not getting any indication, but just let me know, please. And thank you. And I'll get some water. Okay, thanks, Sean. All right, that was a good excuse to take a little water. Okay. So I'll read again. The army was unable to feed all the hungry refugees. In March 1865, Kine was appointed an agent of the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, BRFAL, in Fernandina. The year before, in 1864, Kine, with his wife and his sister-in-law, had been working as missionaries in that seaport. This meant Kine was the first missionary to deal with the African American encampment, which was developing at the Dungeness area at Cumberland's southern end. The Dungeness area traditionally turned to Amelia Island for its news and supplies. Fernandina, only 2 easy miles away by water, had long provided the southern portion of Cumberland with its basic provisions. When the BRFAL was established January 1st, 1865, many volunteer missionaries withdrew, but some were urged to stay on as bureau appointees. Kine remained to become a civilian employee. He was appointed assistant superintendent of teachers in January 1865 by General Rufus Saxton, and in April, Saxton appointed Kine as superintendent of freedmen at Fernandina, Florida. Too valuable an individual for the Bureau to lose, Kine subsequently became the first sub-assistant commissioner of the BRFAL in Fernandina. He was succeeded in this post by Captain Thomas Letty, sometime in November 1866, Kyne having become by that time the superintendent of education by order of General J. Lyman of the BRFAL. Kyne remained at this post in Florida until 1867, reporting voluminously on public education in that state. In his professional career as educator, he seems to have been an unusually able administrator. Kyne handled both his army and missionary careers with outstanding efficiency and clear-headedness. Although he dealt with many Cumberland Island problems, his reports and correspondence appear frequently in the BRFAL's Florida records rather than Georgia. The Kyne family resided in Fernandina. He did much of his office work in Fort Clench. Food shortages in Fernandina in early March 1864 were causing distress among the swelling number of contrabands. In an effort to follow his rather confusing orders from the army, Kyne sent a group of refugees in Fernandina back to Dungeness, where food and some planting implements were distributed to them for sustenance purposes. A new settlement, whose location was not given, was beginning to develop. A year later, in a letter dated September 30th, 1865, another bureau agent named Eaton reported a growing settlement at the property once owned by Mr. Nightingale. Of it, Eaton said, there were 10 acres under cultivation, 1 building, 5 cabins, and 60 freedmen. He was describing a new hamlet. In 1865, Kyne sent lumber for building purposes to the freedmen at that area. Eaton had not meant Dungeness Place. He meant tracts 6 through 7, which were once owned by Nightingale and sold to Robert Stafford in 1834. The settlement, which Eaton described, was begun in 1864 by the encouragement of Kyne, very probably with the full cooperation of Stafford, its owner. There had been a mix-up by the army regarding its support of contrabands. The army could no longer provide enough rations to feed the large number of homeless freedmen congregating in Fernandina. In mid-1864, June 22nd, well before establishment of the BRFAL, Captain Edward Myers, Office of Provost Marshal Fernandina, wrote to Captain Wild, Provost Marshal, District of Florida, saying he was ordered to send to Jacksonville all refugees, contrabands, and all civilians who asked subsistence from the government. This would, he said, include several hundred whites and about the same number of blacks, most of whom were women and children. Captain Myers, surprised at his orders, said that, based upon observation and upon the statement of Mr. Kine, almost every family of the above, both black and white, will soon be able to support themselves. If these people are sent away, the government will have to provide for them. A few weeks later, Captain Wild responded, angrily deploring Myers' extraordinary misapprehension of orders. He was surprised at Myers' lack of understanding and forbade him to interfere with those who were loyally making their own living or needed for labor upon the public works, whether white or black, and will send to me only those who are suspicious characters, prisoners of war, or deserters from the enemy, or refugees for whom no employment can be found, and who are a burden upon the government beyond your means to supply their wants. No freedmen's land certificates have been found for Cumberland Island. On Edisto Island in South Carolina, resident contrabands who desired land warrants had been asked to fill out application forms, after which the freedmen would receive a blank, a ticket with a number. Each freedman staked out his own land, subject to future official survey and inspection. Major Cornelius described the forms used by the Army in South Carolina. As far as I know, no such blanks were distributed in Camden County. The officer in charge had added, sadly, very few of the settlers returned the blanks. Most blanks were lost. If any were issued in Camden County, I have not seen them. Tilson issued vouchers to all freedmen who had lost their certificates. He also issued vouchers to all who had not received certificates but had been settled on the land by Saxton's agents prior to October 19, 1865. Between November 14, 1866 and January 19, 1867, Tilson issued a total of 160 first-class warrants and 16 second-class warrants for land in Georgia. The lots claimed range in size from 10 to 40 acres. I have not found any for Camden County. William F. Eaton, bureau agent for several of the Georgia Sea Islands, including St. Simon's, informed General Tilson that all of the Sherman lands in Georgia had finally been surveyed, but as late as February 1866, titles had not been issued to the freedmen. Word had reached the missionaries that possibly the guarantee would be landholders was not going to be honored after all. So again, let me read that. Titles in 1866 had not been issued to the freedmen, and word had reached the missionaries that possibly the guarantee for would-be landholders was not going to be honored after all. Only those persons having titles were to be permitted to keep the land upon which they had settled. On February 17th, 1866, Tilson issued an order permitting restoration to previous owners of much of the land on St. Simon's Island. He ordered Eaton to consolidate all grants held by freedmen on one portion of each plantation. The remainder of the plantation was to be restored to the former owner, who agreed to hire those freedmen holding invalid warrants. Tilson made no provision to indemnify the freedmen who were dislocated by his orders. I cannot find that any titles were ever issued to freedmen on Cumberland Island, although possessory grants were made to St. Simon's freed people in great numbers. It does not seem that such grants were ever validated on Cumberland Island. Nightingale and Stafford showed by their actions that the Cumberland freedmen were no longer welcome on their tracts. Dungeness was returned to Nightingale on February 27, 1866. It was to Nightingale's personal advantage to keep in his possession the majestic green mansion, not yet lost to fire, and its beautiful gardens, because he wanted to sell it. Nightingale, who was in poor health, had announced he would not return to planting on Cumberland. Stafford, too, was getting old. He had been tested. He may have tested the possibilities of selling out. In 1866, Stafford received orders to purchase his land. Mr. Friend of New York City wanted to put 300 German settlers on Cumberland Island to grow cotton. I want to read that again. Mr. Friend of New York City wanted to put 300 German settlers on Cumberland Island to grow cotton. A similar news item appeared in Savannah's The Daily News and Herald, adding, "It being a well-known fact that a better quality of Sea Island cotton is raised on Cumberland than anywhere else on the Atlantic coast. As far as I know, nothing came of these proposals." In accordance with Agent Eaton's orders, both Nightingale and Stafford turned over some acreage to their freedmen. Camden County's tax records show 1866 to 1867 a loss to Nightingale of 80 acres and to Stafford of 125 acres. The missing acreage was recorded as theirs once again in the 1874 Camden County tax records. But the African American settlers were gone, scattered to the turpentine camps of southeastern Georgia, to the trawlers of Brunswick's fishing communities, or to Albany and Augusta of inland Georgia to seek their relatives. Kine apparently had informed Cumberland freedmen that land allotments would be made to them. In a narrative report dated February 5th, 1868, a bureau agent said one of his chief problems in Fernandina was trying to allay the freedmen's disappointment on learning that they were not going to receive title to land. Very few of them are able to refer this disappointment to the legislation of the U.S. Congress, but rather to my want of interest in or sympathy for them. They are wont to contrast my counsels with those of one of Mr. Kinney, who was an agent of freedmen during the last years of the war and for a short period after peace was established. Such agents often were allowed a wide latitude of authority and generally indulged it. Stafford and Nightingale were aging and discouraged. Neither man felt able to start over. Nightingale died in 1873, Stafford in 1877. Without strong policies favoring Black land tenure, private landowners in southeastern Georgia would have refused to honor the certificates. Enforcement of strong policies became impossible. Few freedmen dared to plant against determined white opposition. For that matter, few whites were up to doing so either. Stafford was one of the few white slaveholders who had dared oppose publicly accepted racial policies. His lifelong support of his children by slave women had earned him contempt, hostility, and derision. Disappointment in his sons and daughters was surely a factor. Stafford did not lack courage, but regret and cynicism, as well as age, combined to force his retreat from planting. BRFAL agent Eaton evidently disliked Robert Stafford. Eaton believed him to be an ardent Southern fire eater. Robert Stafford, who is a man of no mean natural ability and who still lives upon Cumberland, is doing all in his power to urge back the former owners, and being a man naturally born to control, does much to render the people restless and hence unsuccessful. His sympathies are strongly Southern, and there is no question but he did all in his power to aid the rebellion. As early as 1864, Some freedmen very likely moved into Stafford property before the passage of the Sherman Act. Primus Mitchell would have been one of them, assuring the others of their welcome. Primus, not anticipating any opposition, would have vouched for Stafford's ability to pay wages, something most white slaveholders adamantly refused to do. In 1864, Stafford, to encourage planting upon his land, would definitely have considered a rental arrangement. As Eaton had commented, Stafford was for ending the war and returning to normalcy. Primus had a pretty fair opinion of his ex-master. The Carnegies once asked him if Robert Stafford was a good master. Primus remembered his master as a man who never struck a slave but once, when he boxed a man's ears. He reportedly had replied, "Yes, he was a good man. Never knew him to hit but one man. He hit one man so hard that he lost all his hearing in that ear ever after." Mitchell knew a great deal about Stafford's daughters, Cornelia and Nancy, and, as noted, was very likely their uncle. Kyne encouraged a move by contraband groups at Dungeness in late 1864 to stave off their approaching famine. He advised them to take advantage of the planting season in Stafford's provision fields. Although Stafford may have threatened the freedmen in 1866, their mutual disagreements probably began as early as 1865 over profit sharing. Camden County planters were accustomed to their slaves selling plantation produce at his public market in St. Mary's. It was not always clear who profited from such sales. Stafford, a meticulous agriculturalist, maintained a fine plantation. On this island, there was at one time the best equipped cotton plantation in the world. It was the Stafford Plantation and consisted of 8,000 acres, 5,000 of which were cultivated. The owner took great pride in it, and his Negro quarters were laid off just like a town, and everything about the place was neat and orderly. His provision fields were said to yield astonishingly good crops. In early 1862, a Satilla River rice planter, probably Confederate Colonel Duncan L. Clinch, ordered confiscation of corn from Stafford's property as a gift to his soldiers. They made off with about 500 bushels of the largest handsomeness ear corn I had ever seen. Stafford trained his plantation hands well. In 1870, he was unique on Cumberland Island in reporting a market garden, from which he reported $300 worth of market produce. In mid-19th century, even the most cityfied American urban dwellers still remembered that for successful planting, good soil must be prepared well in advance. Unlike the seasons of the North, there is here no perceptible line of demarcation between them. We cannot positively assert that spring has opened or summer or winter begun. So wrote a northern journalist, playfully complaining of Georgia's seemingly perpetual spring. Southeast coastal Georgia had essentially two planting seasons: late September to early October for cool weather vegetables, late March to early April for summer vegetables. Cool weather vegetables include turnips, collards, rutabagas, lettuce, carrots, beets, peas, and broccoli. Summer vegetables include sweet potatoes, okra, eggplant, tomatoes, squash, beans, and peas. Summer vegetables will continue to produce until autumn. The first frost comes usually around December 1st. On the sea islands, however, inhabitants can dig for sweet potatoes well until spring, unless the season is very wet. Irish potatoes are usually planted on Valentine's Day. Heat usually kills the plants about June 1st, but digging for potatoes can continue for another month if it is not too wet. Planting dates are April 1st for warm weather vegetables and October 1st for cool weather vegetables, but when farm animals are used, field preparation might begin a month ahead of each of those dates. Stafford's threat to burn their cabins was perhaps aimed specifically in 1864 to 1865 at the new community then planting on Stafford's land near the Cumberland Baptist Church in Tract 7. This fertile area would be where Primus Mitchell recommended planting. Their experiment in sharing the land did not succeed, and Mitchell, with others of the little settlement, departed Cumberland Island, probably in 1866, probably forced out by Stafford. In 1868, a resident of Brunswick, Georgia, brought charges against one Primus Mitchell at Dungeness. If the charge was desertion, Primus's first wife may have made representations at this time seeking a legal divorce. Primus may have made himself scarce. In 1870, Mitchell turned up at another small, unidentifiable community near St. Mary's. The census enumerator, himself uncertain, tentatively called it Crooked River Settlement. This time, Mitchell was residing with his family. Primus Mitchell, age 45, with Amanda, his wife, age 45, was living in a mixed race community of about 55 persons. The census enumerator placed it in vicinity of St. Mary's. Judging by the number and nature of its residents, this hamlet more resembled the farm of a maritime worker rather than a plantation of an agriculturalist. For one thing, it was small. Residents of Fernandina, Florida, and St. Mary's, Georgia, seaports both, often made careless agriculturalists. They earned their living from local waterways. What interested most of them involved water transport, legitimate or occasionally illicit, pilotage, shipbuilding, ship repairs, smuggling, or even in the early 1800s, occasional piracy. Mitchell moved back to Cumberland in 1874. In 1878, he was assessed for back taxes due for property somewhere on the mainland. Missing pages in the county records make it impossible to determine its location. He reappeared as a Cumberland resident on the U.S. Census in 1880 with his family, now consisting of 7 persons: Primus, his wife, and 5 children. They lived at Brick Hill, the small all-black settlement in the less cultivated northern portion of Cumberland Island. Its abandoned slave cabins were thatch roofed. They housed about 35 propertyless freedmen. 18 of them came from Cumberland Island. Mitchell seems not to have moved from Cumberland Island again. By 1900, Primus and Amanda were stated to be living near Stafford Place. When she died, Primus took a job with William Carnegie, looking after the hounds kept for hunting. Primus is buried at High Point. So here's a picture of the gravestone of Primus Mitchell and Amanda, his wife. It reads, Uncle Primus Mitchell and wife Amanda, born slaves at Stafford, faithful field hands on Cumberland Island until death. So I'll let you look at that picture and then check in with you. Hello, hello. Thank you for joining. Who's here? Hey there. Welcome. I'll come and see everybody. But if it sounds good, let me know still. So this would be figure 12, okay? Although Primus lived in interesting times, his life was relatively uneventful. Apparently unaware of his own limitations, he was always looking for a real preacher to come to his church. He lived in a revolutionary period, and he kept hoping for regeneration. And he kept hoping for regeneration of his church. By church, Primus meant a building of some sort, where believers like himself would testify and bear witness to their gratitude for living. The people who had known Primus remembered him best for his humility and his unquenchable hopefulness. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for that. Sounds good. Okay, part 5, post-war problems. A cloud of disappointment, sorrow, and anger hung over Camden County in the immediate post-war period. All Cumberland Islanders had reason to fear retaliation by regulators from the mainland. And when angered, some Union sympathizers on Cumberland became as murderous as any Confederate guerrilla. Unionist James A. Clubb resided at High Point. Descended from John Clubb, a member of Oglethorpe's regiment. This Clubb family had lived on Cumberland Island since 1802. Loyalists throughout the American Revolution, they held their heads high through adversity. They had always lived on close terms with their relatively few field hands. Edmund Spaulding, lighthouse keeper at the island's north end, testified to Lieutenant Coolidge at Fort Clinch about an atrocity committed by Clubb. Mr. James Clubb, in company with Lewis Harris, took one of the Negroes formerly belonging to Mr. Clubb, tied him to a tree, piled wood around the Negro of James Clubb, named Cato, and set fire to the wood and burnt the Negro to death. During this time, the parties laughed and made sport of his agony. This ghastly episode took place on Turtle River above Brunswick. Clubb lived upon Cumberland in the pine woods to the east of the swamp, i.e., Great Inland Swamp, in the area known nowadays as Yankee Paradise. Word of this event no doubt spread immediately to Clubb's neighbors and servants on the island. Immediately following the war, many planters attempted to establish a new labor system. A variety of labor systems developed following the abolition of slavery, one of them being the squad system. In Camden County, some planters employed gangs of workers who worked together in return for their share of the crop. Squads allowed planters to use the existing plantation settlements. Over time, tenant agriculturalists departed, some to the big city, others to establish new, more isolated homes and fields. This is what happened on Cumberland. Black agriculturalists departed for Fernandina, Florida, Brunswick, Georgia, or retreated to isolated hamlets like Brick Hill on Cumberland Island. General Davis Tilson reported to General Saxton on 1866 his belief that the Sea Island freedmen, like freedmen statewide, expected more done for them as a result of the Sherman Act. Tilson's report emphasized his success in reducing their expectations. During the latter part of last year, i.e., September 1865, and the beginning of this, January 1866, the freedmen were impressed with the belief that the government would give them land, animals, implements, and food to enable them to begin planting for themselves. Grave apprehensions were felt and expressed throughout the state. The disappointment of their hopes. The freedmen would rise on Christmas or New Year's and attempt to take by force what they had been led to expect would be given them. It is difficult to ascertain the source whence they became possessed of this idea, but as far as could be learned, the charge that it has been decimated by the disseminated by the officers of the Bureau is utterly groundless. The freedmen were finally induced to make contracts to labor this year, i.e., 1866. It was only after the most persistent efforts that employers could be persuaded to pay the freedmen reasonable wages. In some instances, they compelled them by threats, the laborer to furnish his own clothing and medicine. Learning these facts, the parties were notified that such contracts would not be permitted, and that the freedmen would receive reasonable compensation for their labors. The employers refused to annul these contracts or to allow the freedmen to go to other parts of the country. Emphasis in original. Employers on the coast, Sea Islands, and southwestern Georgia were easily induced from the first to offer good wages. Soon after the freedmen commenced making contracts, it became evident that the demand for labor exceeded the supply that freely sold in the open market. It would command a higher price than had been required by the Bureau, thereby fully establishing the justice and wisdom of the course being tried. Employers eventually became conscious of the fact and cheerfully acquiesced in the decision of the Bureau. In a later memorandum added to the above, February 14th, 1866, Tilson added more of his observations under the title Organization of the Labor on the Sea Islands. On the 1st of January last, order reached this office directing that the sea islands of the state, which up to that time had been under the control of, BVT, Major General Saxton, should be placed in my charge. On the 3rd of February, 1865, I proceeded to the islands, and on investigation found them in a very unsatisfactory condition, with the exception of the Reverend W.F. Eaton, agent of the BRFAL at St. Simon's Island, and whom I have found to be thoroughly honest and competent. There were no other white men on the outer and more important islands. The freedmen were armed and would not allow any white person to land. They were mostly fed on government rations, and with very few exceptions were spending their, it says ? Time in hunting, fishing, and destroying the cattle, large numbers of which had been left on the island by former owners. It was found that while government was sending them rations, they were slaughtering the deer which abound upon the islands and selling the venison at high prices in Savannah. Tilson found that the freedmen on the sea islands wanted to continue receiving government-issued rations. He opposed their continuation. They insisted that the government should continue to furnish them with rations in whole or in part, representing that they had all the animals, implements, seed, and nearly all the food required to enable them to make a crop this year. But as on the sea islands and rice fields of the state, they had failed the year previous, even when they were fed and assisted by the government to raise sufficient food for their own support. And as there was a great demand for labor at high prices on the coast, I declined to accede to their request, but sent the following order. Tilson ordered Sea Island freedmen go to work or face removal. Anxious to obtain labor for the worried coastal planters, in a letter to Eaton dated April 17th, 1866, Tilson asked him to determine immediately why the islanders would not return to wage work. I learned from Colonel Fox, Major Devereux, who have been endeavoring to obtain laborers on the sea islands, that there are many colored people not having grants of land who are cultivating a small patch of land totally insufficient to give them a support, and that these freed people refuse to work for wages during the time they might well spare from their own small crop, but are spending it hunting, fishing, and loafing. You will at once examine into the condition of all the freed people upon the islands, and will require all those situated as above stated to go to work at once for someone who will give them reasonable compensation, or else leave the island without delay. Should any freed person refuse to obey this order, you will use any force at your disposal to compel obedience. Tilson personally saw to it that his orders were broadly disseminated. Starting March 1866, he undertook visits to the sea islands, where he convened assemblies of freedmen and white landowners to listen to him. In an addendum to his report to General Saxton, Tilson was pleased to say that he successfully mediated their labor disputes. A little later, this order was made to apply to all the sea islands of the state. Procuring a small steamer from time to time, I took the former owners to the different islands, gathered the freedmen together, and explained, impressing on both parties the object and wishes of the Bureau. I was gratified to find a more reasonable disposition on the part of both than I had dared to anticipate. And whereas in many cases each had threatened to shoot the other on sight, when brought together, much of this ill feeling disappeared, and very soon they were able to make arrangements for the owners to return, and the freedmen to labor for them on mutually satisfactory terms. In some instances, the poverty of the owner prevented his planting this year, and upon my recommendation, several northern gentlemen of capital purchased or rented their plantations and employed the freedmen. By some 2 weeks' personal effort, I finally succeeded in settling their question along the entire coast in an amiable manner without once resorting to force. Tilson valued the opinion of Reverend William F. Eaton. He praised Eaton's guidance in these labor disputes. In this and all other similar experiments in the state which have come to my knowledge, it has been clearly demonstrated that the freedmen, if left to work for themselves and control their own labor, will not attain any considerable success. This is the opinion to which the Reverend W. Eaton, who has been agent of this bureau for St. Simon's and adjacent islands from the time the freedmen were first sent there, has been reluctantly forced. No man has had a better or wider opportunity for observation, and no man of my acquaintance is better able to form a just and unbiased opinion. At no time during the existence of the race have the freedmen as a mass been called upon to exercise care, economy, and illegible forethought. It cannot be expected they should, without cultivation, suddenly become possessed of these qualities. Eaton was a free will Baptist minister who came from Maine in 1864, responding to the call for missionary teachers. He and his wife were stationed on St. Simon's Island, residing at the retreat, a plantation owned by Mallory King, a son of Stafford's old congressman, Thomas Butler King. Eaton became a bureau agent in 1865 with the title of supervising agent of this bureau for St. Simon's and of the sea islands south thereof on the coast and belonging to the state of Georgia. Shortly after 1865, he reported on the condition of freedmen on islands lying further to the southward. On January 31st, 1865, he reported that a few colored people had settled on the lower end of Cumberland Island, placed by Mr. Kenny. Nothing in the records suggests the two missionaries knew one another, although apparently their jurisdictions overlapped. Both agents filed reports in 1865 relating to freedmen at Dungeness. Eaton, still resident on St. Simon's Island, reported no freedmen in any other place on Cumberland Island. Either none was there or he was unaware of their presence. Eaton did know, however, that some freedmen clustered at Dungeness had been encouraged by bureau agent Kine to go out from the overcrowded Dungeness encampment back to the fields and plant foodstuffs. Freedmen understood they were to keep what they grew, presumably to feed their families and also to sell at a marketplace. No bureau agent was more active in guiding the freedmen on Cumberland than Kine. A destitution and illness increased. As destitution and illness increased in Fernandina, Kine increased his encouragement to freedmen on Cumberland Island to return to the fields and resume planting food crops. Eaton and Tilson tended to ignore the freedmen's ability to sell foodstuffs. Eaton, a doctrinaire abolitionist from Maine, was unfamiliar with local marketplaces. The degree of his familiarity with farming on the Sea Islands is unknown. In Fernandina, problems with the Army's system of food distribution stimulated military thinking on the subject. The military decided food acquisition must be conducted in an orderly manner. Rationing did not provide the perfect solution to the burgeoning numbers of hungry refugees. Although the idle must not be rewarded, starvation threatened increasingly large numbers of freedmen. The Union officers floated the idea of a marketplace, urging its consideration to help feed Union soldiers. The Major General commanding desires to call the attention of agriculturalists in this department to the importance of raising fruits and vegetables, and in order to facilitate and encourage owners of land in the undertaking hereby, orders a free market to be established at each port in the department, where persons will be permitted to sell their produce from boats and wagons within the lines of the market district. A free competition, it is believed, will soon regulate the prices. A guard will be at the market to maintain order. The soil of these islands is peculiarly peculiarly adapted to raising vegetables, and the crop will amply repay the expenditures required to produce it. The persons living within the limits of the department requiring military protection should have a due regard for the wants of the soldiers and feel a desire to contribute as far as they can to their necessities. Every facility will be given producers to dispose of their crops. By command of Major General J.G. Foster, Assistant Adjutant General. A week later, the Provost Marshal at Fernandina ordered, November 17th, a roster of persons currently receiving government rations. Deserving refugees were to continue receiving them, able-bodied men with families being preferred. You are hereby directed to furnish to this office a duplicate roster of all persons to whom rations are issued at the post of Fernandina, and further to guard against such issues as much as possible, only granting them in case of absolute necessity. You will perceive the importance of this caution by consideration of the heavy burden now resting upon our government, which ought not to be increased by feeding able bodied persons, either male or female. The Bureau responded to the general suffering as best it could, but its resources were limited. On May 31st, 1865, General Oliver Otis Howard informed his assistant commissioners that relief was to be discontinued as rapidly as possible. General Davis Tilson, going even further, criticized freedmen for what he termed their general laziness and their over-eagerness to accept handouts from relief agencies. Neither Tilson nor his successors thought of the freedmen in their area as anything but potential agricultural labor. Yet the Bureau failed to provide certain agricultural necessities for which cash payments were required. For example, seed. Mules and oxen are used for specific farm purposes. So are their wagons and carts. Few freedmen had cash to buy these necessities. An active marketplace was needed. Trouble between freedmen and planters on Cumberland began when freedmen who were strangers to Robert Stafford settled upon tracts 6 and 7. Article 4 of the Sherman Act required that freed people now on the island and having grants of land would not be forced to leave their present domicile until the landowners shall have offered them opportunity of labor on such terms as are satisfactory to the Bureau. If freed people refused to accept this offer, then they were to remove from such plantations, allowing the owners the opportunity to hire others. Many owners were unable to pay wages for farm labor. It was this proviso which soon became unacceptable to both planters and the BRFAL. Planters King, Bass, and Stafford were among the first Sea Island property owners who were ordered by BRFAL agent Eaton to find consolidated acreage within their properties which would be suitable for freedmen to settle upon. Obviously, agriculturally savvy freedmen would look for cleared land, richly fertilized, not too far from some form of transportation by which their crops could be distributed to the mainland. For Cumberland Islanders, this meant water transportation. Stafford's well-equipped docks at a deep-water landing were likely known. Stafford was familiar with share tenancy, a type of tenantry in which tenants would work land on which they were living, allowing landowners to act as brokers. The Stafford family had themselves been share tenants of the General's family. Stafford, who had many white tenants on Cumberland, evidently considered share tenancy as an admirable working model. The original idea behind share tenancies by freedmen was that the freedmen would become tenants instead of working in gangs. The landowner would assign each family a small tract of land to farm and would provide food, shelter, clothing, and the necessary seeds and farm equipment. When the crop was harvested, the landowner would take the crop to market, and after deducing for the furnish the cost of all items the tenant had been furnished during the year, gave half of the proceeds to the tenant. Stafford, acting as a broker, would sell the freedmen's crop for them, giving a portion of the sale receipt to the tenants. The average for tenants was that they had the advantage rather for tenants was that they had a place to live and an opportunity to earn some money at the same time. Subsistence crops and hunting provided tenants, white and black, with food to eat. Stafford very likely cleared much of his land through shared tenancies to white tenants. Timber cutting was an important plantation activity on Cumberland Island. Whatever the reasons, however, neither labor system worked out for Cumberland Island, and the island was almost depopulated by 1867. Okay. I'll stop there and pick back up until we complete. Hello, everybody who's joining. Thank you. Thank you. Please like and subscribe and share. Okay. I will pick back up where I left off right here. That the island was almost depopulated by 1867. Very interesting. Very interesting things in this newsletter that I'm picking up. And I wonder if you're welcome, Molly. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining. I'll look and see what everybody is saying. But I got to run and jump on another, like on a call. But thank you so much, everybody, for being flexible, as I'm going to put more content on this back channel, this backup, and build the backup channel. I'll still put things on that main channel, still working out the technicals of getting inside of the back channel. But I thank you again. Love you all, and God bless you. And we'll pick back up to finish this newsletter article and possibly talk about some of the things that you're picking up on. Please comment if anything comes to you that you're thinking. It is interesting. I have a lot that is becoming more clear about what has happened in America. It's very interesting. Okay. All right. Take care. I'll talk to you later. Bye.